Hello everyone, my name is Truong and my partner is Quoc. We are the MA student of Viettesol from the Ho Chi Minh City Universities of Social Sciences and Humanities. And the article that we want to introduce all of you today is an investigation of non-English majors, common errors and difficulties in using relative clauses. So here is the main content that we want to introduce to all of you. As you can see in the screen now, our articles will briefly present it from the introduction, literature review, methodology, results and finding, and come to the conclusion. So now we will come first to the background to the study. Language play an important role in the mastery of communication all over the world. People learn a language for many reasons, such as for the purpose of study, communication, or business activity. So, according to ASA 1993, a clause is a set of words which contain subject and verb. And according to him, in his research 2002, the relative clause is an essential item to understand because it concerns to a clause or sentence that plays an important role in a language. And he also said that if some students understand well about the relative clause, they will avoid the misunderstanding about the sentence that they read. As a result, he stated that the students who can employ relative clauses in dependent clauses can greatly increase their communicative competence in the language. However, in fact, not all students, especially the EFL students, are able to master the rules of relative clauses easily. Sometimes students do not know how to use the relative clause and they often make errors in using relative clauses rules. With these reasons mentioned above, the researcher wants to conduct a study to address and to find out more about this problem. So here is the aims of the study. The researchers conducted this study with a view to finding out common errors made by non-English major students in using relative clauses. Secondly, they also want to figure out their difficulty and situation in learning and using relative clauses. To the significance of the study, the result of the study will give both lecturers and students helpful information about the features of student common errors in using relative clauses. In particular, for the lecturers, based on the finding of the research, they will be able to find a proper methods to decrease the student common errors in using this grammar point. And secondly, for the students, the study can provide them a general view of the student ability in understanding the relative clauses. Secondly, they also can be used as a self-reflection for the student to better their study, especially related to the use of relative clauses. Come to the scope of the study. Firstly, this study focuses on the use of relative clauses of non-English major students who are having English courses in the English Center. Secondly, the findings of the study will be significantly various thanks to the wide range of participant background. And finally, the findings of this research are only devoted to test students' ability in using relative clauses. So now we come to the research questions. To address the purpose of the study, the researcher come up with the two research questions. The first one is, what are the common errors made by non-English major in using relative clauses? And the second one is that, what are students' difficulties and suggestions in learning relative clauses? So we come to the literature review. First one is the definition of relative clauses. Obviously, there are many different definitions of relative clauses from many different authors. For example, according to Ayer and Hagen 2009, the relative clause is defined as a dependent clause, which means that relative clause has to be connected to an independent clause to form a complete sentence. Besides, according to Miller and Viettesol 2019, they explain a relative clause as an adjectival clause that describes or defines the noun, in which a relative clause will function as a bold modifier of a noun phrase. So in brief, in this study, the researcher want to define the relative clause as the dependent clauses which add a post modifier and had to be linked to main clauses to form a complete sentence. Now we come to the categorization of the relative clauses. According to Foley and Horn 2003, they divided relative clauses into two types. The first one is the defining clauses. The second one is the non-defining clauses. So for the first one, a defining clause is used to identify and classify a noun or pronoun in the main clause. Meanwhile, a non-defining clause is used to add extra information about the subject of a main clause. How about categorization of relative pronouns? According to Miller and Viettesol 2019, relative clause can be divided into relative pronouns at who, whom, whose, that, and what, as you can see on the screen, and relative adverbs at when, where, and why. So we come to the error. What is the error? It's also be defined by different authors. For example, according to Roth, 1990, an error is a deviation from the norms of the target language. Or from Quoc 2001, an error is an unsuccessful bit of language. So in this study, errors is being seen as deviation from acceptable standards of the target language. Okay, we come to previous study. Clearly that there are some similar studies related to the relative clauses were conducted by some foreign researchers such as Mohan 2016 or Zuckerman also in 2016. And so now you can see the article by Zuckerman called an analysis of all students' error and difficulties in using relative clauses 2016. In this research, the researcher want to find out the errors made by EFL students in using relative clauses. And finally, they also want to figure out what makes the EFL student do error. He applied the descriptive research design and used a simple random sampling to choose the sample of the research. And the result of this research showed that the student got most of the error on relative clause whose with 88.75% and whom with 60%. And in terms of the reason, the factors that make the student have error, they are the confusion in using relative clause, the overemphasis on language forms, the lacking in vocabulary mastery, and finally in the language transfer problem. When it comes to Vietnamese context, there are absolutely some similar studies related to the student problems of using relative clauses. Like you can see, for example, here, an analysis of linguistic error committed in translation by English major student at Hoover University by Phạm Thị Kim Cúc and her partners. Or The error in translating English relative clauses into Vietnamese by third-year English major at Cần Thơ University by June 2010. However, most of these research focus on the student problems in translating relative clauses from English to Vietnamese. And there are very few studies which pay attention to Vietnamese students' error using relative clauses. So it's also the reason that led the researcher to conduct the study to find out the common errors made by Vietnamese students in using relative clauses and then suggest some pedagogical implications for teaching and learning this important grammatical point. Now we come to the methodology part. Once again, the research questions of this study is that what are the common errors made by non-English majors in using relative clauses? Second, what are the student difficulty and suggestions in learning relative clauses? Related to the research design, the researcher applied the quantitative research design and they use the test and interview as the research tools to collect the data. For the participant, the researcher employed 42 non-English major students who have been English course in the AIM English Center. And for collecting data, first of all, a test of 20 multiple choice questions related to 7 types of relative clauses is given to the participant via the help of Google Form, and the time is limited in 20 minutes, so that the participant have to finish their work. And secondly, the researcher conducted the interview of 11 students who are willing to take part in our research. And each interview lasts from 10 to 15 minutes for each student. And for the data analysis procedure, for the first research question, the researcher used the percentage formula to find out which one will be the most common error making by the student. And for the second research question, the researcher tried to call the team of the student of the participant response from the interview to find out the student difficulty and also their suggestion in learning the relative clauses. Okay, so now we come to the result of the study, and it will be presented by Mr. Xuan Quoc. Okay, thank you everyone.
Thank you, Ms. Mindang, for talking about the introduction, literature review, and methodology. And from those methodology, we have found out some results that will answer the true research questions. So for the first research question, what are the common errors made by non-English majors in using relative clauses? And as you can see here in the diagram, up to 40.5% of our students fail to recognize the use of that as the subject pronoun when the sentence has a superlative structure. As you can see here, we have the first person. So this question, right, has a superlative structure, which needs the use of that. However, 17 of the students here chose when and whom instead of that. Also, up to 70% of the students fail to recognize the use of where as a relative adverb. So for the second research question, What are students' difficulties and suggestions in learning relative glosses? So we have two aspects to consider here, difficulties and suggestions. So for difficulties, the first theme that emerged is the confusion, right? The students' confusion between choosing which and where. I found it difficult to differentiate between nouns referring to things and nouns referring to places. Participants 1, 2, 3, 4, and 7, right? They found it hard to make a difference between which and where, when to use which and when to use where. Secondly, students' confusion between choosing which and that. Sometimes I don't know when to use which and when to use that. Thirdly, their uncertainty of using that. I don't remember all cases that I have to use that. I assume that that can replace all of other types. So from the interviews, we can see clearly that the students here, they are uncertain of the use of that when it comes to relative clauses. Number four, the lack of vocabulary. I misunderstood the meaning of the sentence. I don't know the meaning of the nouns. So their lack of vocabulary also leads to their failure in choosing the correct answer. Regarding the students' suggestions, firstly, they suggested that there should be more practice assigned to them to help them familiar with this grammar point. I think that more practice tasks to get familiar with this grammar point, right? There should be more. Secondly, they want the teacher to give more examples for each type of relative clauses. I expect that the teacher will emphasize on special cases when using relative clauses. So this is about teaching practices, and they want some changes in the way the teacher teaches this grammar point to them. I think teachers should teach students how to identify the noun. So in conclusion, non-English majors in English Center commonly made errors using relative adverb where and relative pronoun that with the existence of a superlative structure. So there are two common errors when it comes to using when it comes to using relative pronouns are using relative adverb where and using relative pronoun that with the case of a superlative structure. Also, most of students' difficulties are the confusion between choosing which and that, their uncertainty of using that, the confusion between choosing which and where, and the lack of vocabulary. So for their suggestions, they suggest that there should be more assigned practice tasks. Also, there need to be an improvement in teaching practices. So for the limitation of a study, because this is a case study, so the number of participants was small. Also, the context was only set in the English Center, so it's kind of hard for the authors to generalize the results. So our suggestions for further study is that Further study should include a more variety of participants. And this is the end of our presentation. We're looking forward to your questions, if there is any. Thank you.